There's a special kind of loneliness that comes with drowning in silence while everyone around you assumes you're fine. It's the isolation of carrying burdens too heavy for small shoulders, of facing problems too complex for a young mind, all while maintaining the facade that everything is okay. This is the story of Emma, a child who learned that asking for help was more dangerous than suffering alone. By the time she was 10 years old, she had become an expert at invisible struggle, carrying her pain like a secret, solving her problems in the shadows, and convincing the world that she needed nothing from anyone. Emma wasn't born self-reliant. No child is. Every baby enters the world completely dependent, instinctively knowing that survival depends on others responding to their cries. But somewhere between her first plea for comfort and her 10th birthday, Emma learned a devastating lesson. Asking for help was a luxury she couldn't afford. It started subtly, as these patterns often do. When Emma was 5 and fell from her bike, scraping her knee badly enough to draw blood, she ran to her mother for comfort. But her mother, overwhelmed by her own struggles with depression, snapped, "Oh, Emma, not now. Can't you see I'm having a hard day? It's just a little scrape. You're fine." The message was clear. Other people's problems were more important than hers. Other people's pain took priority. Her needs were inconvenient interruptions in a world that had bigger concerns. Child psychologists call this emotional parentification. When children learn to suppress their own needs to protect their caregiver's emotional state. Dr. Gregory Yurkovich, who extensively studied this phenomenon, found that parentified children often develop what he terms compulsive self-reliance, an inability to seek support, even when they desperately need it. For Emma, this meant learning to become her own parent, her own comforter, her own problem solver. When she struggled with homework, she stayed up late figuring it out alone rather than asking for help. When kids at school bullied her, she developed elaborate strategies to avoid them rather than telling a teacher or a parent. When she felt sad or scared, she retreated to her room to comfort herself rather than seeking solace from adults. Picture Emma at age 7. Sitting at the kitchen table with math homework that might as well have been written in a foreign language. The numbers swam before her eyes, the concept slipping away like water through her fingers. She wanted to ask her father for help, but he was on his 3rd beer, staring at the television with the hollow look that meant he was unreachable. She had learned to read these moments when adults were too tired, too stressed, too overwhelmed to handle one more request. So she sat there until bedtime, erasing and re-erasing the same problems, eventually turning in homework that was wrong but completed. Her teacher marked it with red ink, but Emma never mentioned needing help. She had learned that struggle was something you endured alone. The psychology behind this pattern runs deep. Children who don't learn to ask for help often come from families where the adults are emotionally unavailable, not necessarily absent, but overwhelmed by their own unresolved trauma, mental health issues, or life circumstances. These parents aren't intentionally neglectful. They're simply too depleted too consistently. Respond to their children's needs, Dr. Alice Miller wrote extensively about how children adapt to their caregivers' limitations by becoming what she calls gifted children, not intellectually gifted, but gifted at reading emotional cues, anticipating needs, and managing their own distress without burdening others. These children develop hypervigilance to others' emotional states while losing touch with their own. Emma became a master of this emotional radar. She could sense her mother's depression from across the room, feel her father's anxiety in the way he held his shoulders. She learned to time her requests carefully, ever when mom was crying, never when dad was drinking, never when the house felt heavy with unspoken tension. But more often than not, there was no good time. So Emma learned to stop asking altogether. The tragedy of children who don't learn to ask for help is that they become incredibly competent at managing crisis alone. But they never learn that support is available, that problems can be shared. That strength can come from connection rather than isolation. By middle school, Emma had developed what looked like impressive independence. She managed her own schedule, solved her own problems, comforted herself through difficulties. Teachers praised her maturity. Other parents wished their children were as self-sufficient. But what looked like strength was actually a survival mechanism born from emotional abandonment. The neuroscience behind this adaptation is profound. When children's bids for help are consistently ignored or met with irritation, their brains learn to suppress the neurological impulses that drive help-seeking behavior. The circuits that should connect distress to social support get rewired to connect distress to self-reliance. Dr. Stephen Porges. Research on the nervous system shows that healthy development requires what he calls co-regulation, the ability to use relationships to manage overwhelming emotions. But children like Emma learn dysregulation through isolation. The pattern intensified in high school. When Emma faced her first real crisis, her best friend, her only real friend, moved away unexpectedly. Emma was devastated, but she had no framework for seeking comfort. She couldn't imagine going to her parents with something as trivial as friendship problems. She couldn't fathom that her pain might be worthy of attention or support, so she suffered in silence, crying herself to sleep for weeks while maintaining her usual competent facade. Her grades didn't slip, she was too disciplined for that. Her behavior didn't change, she was too controlled for that. But inside, she was drowning. No one knew, because she had never learned to signal distress. This is the cruel paradox of children who don't learn to ask for help. They become so good at managing alone that others assume they don't need support. Their competence becomes a barrier to connection. Their strength becomes a prison that keeps them isolated, even when surrounded by people who might want to help. Emma's teachers saw a mature, capable student. Her classmates saw someone who had everything figured out. Her parents saw a child who never caused problems. But none of them saw the lonely, overwhelmed teenager who was carrying the weight of her world without support. The long-term effects of this pattern are profound. Adults who never learned to ask for help as children often struggle with what psychologists call intimacy, avoidance. They're drawn to relationships, but terrified of the vulnerability that real connection requires. They become the strong friend everyone relies on, but never the friend who admits needing support. In romantic relationships, they're partners who give endlessly but rarely receive. They attract people who need caretaking, recreating the childhood dynamic where their worth was tied to how little they asked for, rather than how much they were loved. Emma's journey toward healing began in her late 20s, when a panic attack forced her to confront what she had been avoiding. She was burning out from carrying everything alone. For the first time in her adult life, she found herself in a crisis she couldn't manage independently. The panic attack happened at work, in front of colleagues who had always seen her as unflappable. When her supervisor suggested she might need professional help, Emma's first instinct was to minimize, to reassure, to prove she was fine. But something in her had broken, or perhaps something had finally broken open. In therapy, Emma began to understand the impossible bind she had been placed in as a child. She had been asked to be mature beyond her years, to manage her own needs so that overwhelmed adults didn't have to. She had been rewarded for her self-sufficiency and punished through neglect for her neediness. Learning to ask for help as an adult required Emma to challenge beliefs that had kept her safe in childhood but were limiting her in adulthood. She had to practice the vulnerable act of saying, "I don't know, and I need support, and this is too much for me to handle alone." The process was terrifying because asking for help meant risking the rejection she had learned to avoid through self-reliance. Every request felt like an imposition. Every need felt like a burden. Emma had to relearn the fundamental truth that healthy relationships involve mutual support, that needing others doesn't make you weak, that asking for help is actually a skill that strengthens connections rather than threatening them. Research in attachment theory shows that the ability to seek and accept help is crucial for mental health and relationship satisfaction. Dr. John Bowlby found that secure attachment develops when children learn they can depend on caregivers to respond to their distress, but children like Emma develop what's called avoidant attachment. They learn to suppress their needs and handle distress alone. The beautiful discovery Emma made in her healing journey was that it's never too late to develop secure attachment patterns. Through therapy, through carefully chosen friendships, Through the patient practice of vulnerability, she began to rewire decades of conditioning. She started small, admitting when she didn't understand something at work, asking a friend to listen when she was stressed, letting her partner comfort her when she was sad. Each act of help-seeking felt revolutionary because it challenged the core belief that had shaped her childhood, that her needs were too much for others to handle. What Emma discovered was transformative. Most people actually want to help. Healthy people find meaning in supporting others. Connection deepens when we allow ourselves to be known in our struggles as well as our strengths. The psychology of children who never learn to ask for help reveals something crucial about human development. We are not meant to suffer alone. The ability to seek and receive support is not a weakness, it's a fundamental life skill. Children who don't develop this skill don't become stronger. They become isolated. But the story doesn't end with childhood conditioning. The human brain remains plastic throughout life, capable of forming new patterns, new beliefs, new ways of connecting. Adults who grew up believing they had to handle everything alone can learn that interdependence is not only possible but necessary for thriving. If you recognize yourself in Emma's story, if you're someone who learned early that asking for help was dangerous, your needs were inconvenient, that strength meant suffering in silence. Know this: you were not born to carry the world alone. Silence you learned was not wisdom. It was a survival strategy. The self-reliance you developed was not strength. It was adaptation to an environment that couldn't handle your authentic needs. You deserved support then, and you deserve support now. Learning to ask for help is not about becoming dependent or weak. It's about recognizing that you are worthy of care, that your struggles matter, that connection is stronger than isolation. It's about understanding that the very vulnerability you were taught to hide is actually the foundation of meaningful relationships. The silent struggle doesn't have to remain silent. The burdens you've carried alone don't have to stay on your shoulders. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is whisper the words you were never allowed to say as a child. I need help. Because in the end, we are not meant to be islands of self-sufficiency. We are meant to be part of an archipelago of support, connected by bridges of vulnerability and mutual care. And sometimes, learning to ask for help is the first step toward building those bridges. The child who never learned to ask for help can become the adult who models healthy interdependence. And in that transformation lies not just personal healing, but the possibility of creating a world where no child has to suffer in silence.